In this video, we uncover what happened to these exotic pet owners who paid the ultimate price when their animals turned on them. From a reptile enthusiast in Florida who made one small mistake during a routine feeding, to a graphic designer enthusiast in Warsaw who learned that 6 years of experience means nothing when a green mamba decides to strike. But first, we talk about the last moments of exotic pet owner Cassandra Holt. It was March 14th, 2013, and the humid evening air outside Tampa, Florida, had settled into the kind of stillness that makes small sounds carry further than they should. Inside a converted garage on the outskirts of Riverview, 26-year-old Cassandra Holt was preparing to feed her Gaboon viper, a ritual she had performed dozens of times without incident. The garage smelled of cedar shavings and heat lamps, the quiet hum of thermostats and filtration systems the only sound in the room. To anyone else, it would have felt clinical, even unsettling. To Cassandra, it felt like home. Friends described Cassandra as meticulous and deeply passionate about exotic reptiles, someone who had spent months researching permit requirements, enclosure specifications, and feeding protocols before ever acquiring the snake. She worked part-time at a local pet supply store and spent most of her remaining hours caring for her collection. 5 enclosures in total, each maintained with the same precision a surgeon might apply to an operating theater. The Gaboon viper was her most prized animal, and her most dangerous. She knew that. She had never once let herself forget it. Until the evening of March 14th. The Gaboon viper, native to the rainforests and savannas of sub-Saharan Africa, holds several grim distinctions. It produces one of the highest venom yields of any snake in the world. Its fangs, the longest of any venomous snake, reaching up to 2 inches, are capable of delivering a massive venom load deep into tissue in a fraction of a second. The venom is a devastating combination of hemotoxic and cytotoxic compounds, destroying red blood cells, breaking down tissue at the cellular level, and triggering disseminated intravascular coagulation, a condition in which the blood's clotting mechanisms fail catastrophically, causing simultaneous clotting and hemorrhage throughout the body. Even with aggressive medical intervention, massive envenomations can be fatal. Cassandra's standard feeding protocol reflected everything she knew about that danger. A frozen thawed rat, warmed to body temperature, presented at the end of long metal tongs through a side port in a separate feeding enclosure, her hands never above the animal, every variable controlled. It required setting up the secondary enclosure, coaxing the snake through a transfer tube, and waiting for the animal to settle before introducing the prey. The entire procedure took the better part of an hour when performed correctly. Cassandra had never once complained about the time it took. She had designed the protocol herself, and she believed in it completely. On the evening of March 14th, she was tired. She had worked a long shift, her feet ached, and the snake was 3 days overdue for its feeding. She stood in the garage doorway and made the kind of calculation that experienced keepers describe as the most dangerous moment in exotic animal husbandry. She decided the risk was acceptable. She would feed the snake directly in its primary enclosure, dangling the rat over the open top with her tongs. She had seen other keepers do it. It would save an hour. She lifted the enclosure lid and lowered the tongs, the warmed rat dangling above the Gaboon viper's coiled body. The snake was resting near the center of the enclosure, its camouflage pattern of browns and geometric shapes, making it look almost like a pile of dead leaves. Its eyes were open, its tongue flicked slowly, tasting the air. Its head began to track the movement of the rat with the quiet, mechanical focus of an animal that has been perfecting this moment for millions of years. It didn't strike the rat. The snake lunged upward and drove its 2-inch fangs into the volar surface of Cassandra's forearm at approximately 7:42 p.m., jaws flexing for nearly a second as an exceptionally large venom load was forced deep into the tissue. Cassandra yanked her arm back and stared at the 2 puncture wounds, already welling with blood that looked thinner than it should, the first sign that her clotting mechanisms were already beginning to fail. She called 911 within minutes, her voice steady despite what she knew was happening. She gave the dispatcher the species name, the size of the snake, and told them she would need anti-venom. Before the trembling in her hands made it impossible, she walked to her front door and unlocked it. Paramedics arrived at 7:54 p.m., 12 minutes after the strike. Her forearm had already swollen dramatically, the tissue darkening with bruising as the venom spread through the surrounding vasculature. She was loaded into the ambulance and reached Tampa General Hospital at 8:19 p.m. Over the following hours, her condition deteriorated in the way severe Gaboon viper envenomations characteristically do. Not as a sudden collapse, but as a progressive, systematic unraveling. Her blood lost the ability to clot. Internal bleeding began at multiple sites. She was intubated at approximately 9:40 p.m. as her blood pressure continued to fall despite vasopressor support. Hospital staff immediately contacted officials, which coordinated an emergency transfer of polyvalent African antivenom from the Miami Zoo's herpetology stock, one of the few facilities in the southeastern United States maintaining a supply adequate for a severe gaboon viper envenomation. The antivenom arrived and was administered at 11:55 p.m., over 4 hours after the initial bite. It halted further venom activity, but antivenom neutralizes circulating venom. It does not undo tissue destruction already done. It does not restore clotting factors already consumed. By the time the first vial was administered, extensive coagulopathy and hemorrhagic shock had already progressed beyond reversible thresholds. Her kidneys began to fail. Her blood pressure continued to fall despite every intervention the team could offer. Cassandra Holt was pronounced dead at 2:17 a.m. on March 15th. She was 26 years old. Examiner's autopsy, completed the following week, documented findings consistent with massive envenomation, diffuse internal hemorrhage across multiple organ systems, extensive soft tissue necrosis at and proximal to the envenomation site, acute tubular necrosis of the kidneys, and frank coagulopathy throughout the vascular system. The cause of death was recorded as hemorrhagic shock, secondary to envenomation by Bitis gabonica. There were no findings inconsistent with the account provided by first responders. While Cassandra Holt's feeding shortcut proved fatal, a reptile enthusiast in Queensland, Australia would soon learn that size alone makes certain animals inherently lethal. It was March 3rd, 2014, and the tropical humidity of northern Queensland hung thick in the air near Townsville, where the afternoon heat made even simple tasks feel exhausting. Inside a property on the outskirts of town, a routine enclosure cleaning was about to demonstrate why large constrictors should never be handled alone. Darren Cole was a 35-year-old reptile enthusiast who worked as an automotive mechanic in Townsville, a job that kept him busy during the day, but left his evenings free for the hobby that had consumed most of his adult life. Friends described him as methodical and patient, traits that served him well both in the garage and in his reptile room, where heat lamps, thermostats, and carefully labeled enclosures reflected his preference for order and routine. He had started keeping reptiles in his early 20s, beginning with small species like corn snakes and bearded dragons before gradually moving toward larger constrictors. Over the years, Darren built a modest but impressive collection that included several boas and a single reticulated python, a 16-foot specimen he had raised from a juvenile. Experienced reptile keepers universally recommend a two-person protocol when handling snakes over 10 feet in length, ensuring that if the snake begins constricting, a second person can help break the coils. Darren occasionally followed this advice. On March 3rd, he didn't. He had decided to clean the python's enclosure, a task that required temporarily removing the snake or allowing it partial freedom while he worked. Darren chose the latter, letting the python move freely in the room while he cleaned. The snake, accustomed to the routine, initially showed little interest in Darren's activities, coiling loosely in a corner. As Darren bent down to lift the water basin, his body in a vulnerable crouched position, the python began moving toward him. It wasn't an aggressive approach. Reticulated pythons don't attack out of malice. They respond to stimuli, heat, movement, and the opportunity to anchor themselves around something stable. Darren's bent posture and proximity made him an ideal anchor point. The python wrapped around Darren's leg first, then his torso, its muscular coils encircling his body with the methodical efficiency of a predator that has perfected this technique over millions of years. Reticulated pythons are among the world's longest snakes, regularly exceeding 20 feet in length. They kill prey by wrapping around it and tightening their coils each time the victim exhales, not by crushing bones or blocking the airway, but by preventing the chest from expanding and restricting blood flow. Unconsciousness can occur within minutes. The snake doesn't need to be aggressive. It simply needs to wrap and maintain pressure. Darren immediately recognized the danger. He tried to unwrap the coils, but once the second loop locked across his chest, the window to escape narrowed dramatically. A 16-foot reticulated python possesses overwhelming strength once full constriction is established. Each time Darren exhaled, the python tightened its grip. Each breath became shallower than the last. He tried to reach for his phone, but his arms were pinned. He tried to call for help, but the pressure made it impossible to draw enough breath to shout. The python wasn't squeezing with theatrical violence. It didn't need to. It maintained steady, incremental pressure, responding to movement the way constrictors have for millions of years. Darren's vision began to darken as oxygen deprivation and restricted circulation affected his brain. His attempts to break free grew weaker as his muscles were deprived of oxygen. Alone on the property, with no one to hear him and no way to call for help, Darren lost consciousness. He was discovered later that evening by a friend stopping by for a scheduled visit. The python was still loosely coiled around Darren's body, remaining in contact but no longer actively tightening. Wildlife authorities removed the snake using the two-person protocol that Darren had chosen not to follow. The cause of death was mechanical asphyxia due to thoracic compression, the medical term for what happens when a constrictor prevents your chest from expanding and restricts circulation. While Darren Cole's solitary handling of a massive python ended in constriction and death, a wolf dog owner in Texas would soon learn that hybrid animals retain the instincts of their wild ancestors. It was October 9th, 2018, and the pleasant autumn weather in Houston, Texas, had drawn Melissa Grant and her friends to her backyard for an afternoon gathering. The smell of grilled meat filled the air as guests mingled, enjoying the rare break from Houston's oppressive heat. Inside the house, in a custom-built enclosure occupying most of a spare bedroom, Melissa's reticulated python, a female measuring just over 17 feet and weighing in excess of 140 pounds, had not been fed in 12 days. Melissa Grant was a 32-year-old marketing coordinator who lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Houston. Outside of work, she devoted much of her time to the unusual hobby that had defined her life for nearly a decade, keeping exotic reptiles. What had started as a childhood fascination with snakes during visits to local zoos had gradually evolved into full ownership as an adult. Friends described Melissa as enthusiastic and deeply invested in her animals. She maintained an active social media presence where she documented the care of her reptiles, posting photos of enclosure upgrades, feeding routines, and the steady growth of the reticulated python she had raised from a small juvenile. To her, the snake wasn't simply an exotic specimen. It was something closer to a long-term project, a creature she believed she understood better than most people. Over 6 years, she had invested thousands of dollars into proper housing, building increasingly larger enclosures as the snake grew from 3 feet to more than 17. By most external measures, Melissa was a responsible keeper. She followed feeding schedules, monitored temperatures carefully, and regularly consulted online reptile communities for advice. What those protocols emphasized, and what experienced keepers repeat with the consistency of a warning label, was a simple rule. Never handle a reticulated python of significant size shortly before or after feeding, and never handle one when you smell of food. The python's feeding response is not aggression in the way the word is commonly understood. It is something older and more mechanical, a stimulus-triggered predatory sequence that, once initiated, the animal does not have the neurological architecture to interrupt. The snake does not decide to constrict. It simply does. Melissa had followed this rule reliably for 6 years. On the afternoon of October 9th, she broke it without fully realizing she had. After spending several hours near the backyard grill, her clothing and skin carrying the smell of cooked meat, she stepped inside to check on the python before her guests left. She had done this hundreds of times. The snake knew her. She believed that familiarity offered a margin of safety that it did not. She opened the enclosure and reached in to lift the python, a handling technique she had used routinely, supporting the animal's weight along her arms and shoulders. The python's tongue flickered. Its head tracked her hands. Then, in the unhurried, purposeful way that large constrictors move when they are not alarmed but responding to stimulus, it struck. The strike was sudden and precise, the python's recurved teeth sinking into Melissa's forearm and locking in place the way they evolved to hold struggling prey. A guest in the adjoining hallway found Melissa already wrapped for around 7 minutes, the python's body looping across her torso with the slow, relentless hydraulic pressure that makes large constrictors so dangerous. The snake was not attacking. To its nervous system, the sequence had already begun. Reticulated pythons are the longest snakes in the world and among the heaviest. A 17-foot, 140-pound specimen generates constriction forces sufficient to restrict breathing and, at full engagement, to cause traumatic asphyxia, the mechanical compression of the chest and diaphragm beyond the body's ability to inhale against it. The snake tightens incrementally with each exhale, a passive ratcheting effect that requires no sustained muscular effort from the animal. The prey simply runs out of room to breathe. The guest who discovered Melissa attempted to uncoil the snake but could not generate sufficient leverage alone. A second guest entered the room, and together they worked to loosen the python's grip, an effort made harder by the fact that pulling against a constricting python triggers it to tighten further. By the time they succeeded in uncoiling the animal and moving it away from Melissa, she had lost consciousness. Emergency services arrived within 8 minutes of the 911 call. Melissa was unresponsive and not breathing. Resuscitation efforts continued en route to the hospital, but were unsuccessful. The cause of death was from constriction. The python was surrendered to animal control and later transferred to a licensed reptile sanctuary. No charges were filed. Melissa had kept the animal legally, with the appropriate permits, and the incident was ruled accidental. While Melissa Grant's fatal lapse came after years of careful ownership, an exotic pet owner in the Philippines would soon discover that juvenile crocodiles grow into apex predators faster than their enclosures can contain them. It was May 22, 2015, and the humid air of the southern Philippines carried the scent of rain and vegetation as afternoon storms gathered over the surrounding jungle. On the outskirts of the city, in a property that blended residential living with illegal wildlife keeping, Rico Mendez was preparing to feed his most dangerous possession, a saltwater crocodile that had long since outgrown the category of manageable pet. Rico Mendez was a 38-year-old small business owner who had developed a fascination with exotic animals years earlier, after working briefly with a local wildlife trader. What began as casual curiosity quickly turned into something closer to obsession. Rico enjoyed the attention that unusual animals attracted, and friends who visited his property often found themselves being shown cages, aquariums, and improvised enclosures housing creatures rarely seen in private homes. Those who knew him described Rico as bold and confident, sometimes to the point of recklessness. He took pride in handling animals others would never approach, often insisting that patience and familiarity allowed him to control creatures that most people considered dangerous. When he purchased a juvenile saltwater crocodile from wildlife traffickers, he treated the acquisition as both a personal challenge and a symbol of status. At 2 feet long, the crocodile appeared manageable, small enough to carry in one hand and easy to house in the concrete pool he constructed in his backyard. Rico had built an enclosure in his backyard, a concrete pool approximately 15 feet long and 8 feet wide, surrounded by a low wall he believed was sufficient to contain the animal. What Rico had failed to account for was the growth rate of saltwater crocodiles. These animals are the largest living reptiles, with males regularly exceeding 16 feet in length and weighing over 1,000 pounds. They grow rapidly when well fed, and Rico had fed his crocodile well. By May 2015, the animal had reached approximately 10 feet and weighed an estimated 400 pounds, having developed the full hunting instincts of an apex predator. Friends who visited Rico's property described the crocodile as increasingly aggressive, lunging at the enclosure walls and displaying the territorial behavior wild crocodiles show when defending their space. Rico dismissed these concerns, insisting that the animal recognized him and posed no threat as long as he followed his feeding routine. On the afternoon of May 22nd, Rico prepared the crocodile's meal, several pounds of raw chicken he planned to toss into the enclosure from above. He had performed this feeding routine dozens of times, standing at the edge and dropping the meat into the water while the crocodile waited below. This time, Rico decided to hand feed the chicken, holding it over the water's edge to watch the crocodile's feeding behavior. He leaned over the low wall, extending his arm with the raw chicken clutched in his hand, positioning himself directly above the waterline. Saltwater crocodiles are ambush predators that have perfected the art of explosive attacks. They can launch themselves vertically out of the water, with enough force to snatch prey from overhanging branches. Their jaws exert a bite force exceeding 3,700 pounds per square inch, the strongest of any living animal, capable of crushing a water buffalo's skull. Their strategy, refined over millions of years, wait motionless, then strike with overwhelming speed and power. The crocodile had been waiting just below the surface, its eyes and nostrils barely visible above the waterline. When Rico's arm extended over the water with the scent of raw meat, the crocodile exploded upward. The attack happened faster than Rico could process. The crocodile's jaws clamped around his forearm with crushing force, teeth penetrating through muscle and grinding against bone. The impact fractured Rico's radius and ulna, and the crocodile's momentum pulled him forward over the low wall. Rico fell into the enclosure, landing in the water with the crocodile still attached to his arm. He tried to scream, but within seconds the crocodile initiated a death roll, the signature killing technique of crocodilians, where the animal spins rapidly along its longitudinal axis while maintaining its grip. The death roll is one of nature's most effective killing methods. The spinning motion generates enormous torque, tearing flesh and breaking bones while disorienting the victim completely. For Rico, trapped in the water with a 400-pound apex predator, it was catastrophic. The crocodile spun through the water, Rico's body whipping around with violent force. The rotational force tore his arm severely at the shoulder, leaving it nearly detached. and the surrounding tissue catastrophically damaged. The crocodile released and repositioned, clamping its jaws around Rico's torso within seconds and initiating another death roll. The water around him turned red. Rico's ribs fractured under the crushing pressure. His lung was punctured by broken ribs and crocodile teeth. He tried to surface for air, but the crocodile's weight and the disorienting spin made it impossible to determine which direction was up. Water filled his punctured lung. His consciousness faded as blood loss and drowning combined to shut down his body's systems. The entire attack lasted less than 2 minutes. By the time neighbors, alerted by the splashing and brief screams, arrived at the enclosure, Rico's body was floating face down in the water, still guarded by the crocodile that had killed him. Authorities were called, and a team of wildlife officers arrived to remove the crocodile from the enclosure. Following consultation with wildlife authorities and veterinary experts, the animal was euthanized, and Rico's body was recovered. The cause of death was determined to be a combination of traumatic injuries, blood loss, and drowning. While Rico Mendez's hand-feeding experiment ended in a death roll and dismemberment, a reptile keeper in Poland would soon discover that green mambas combine speed with neurotoxicity in a way that leaves almost no margin for error. It was January 17, 2013, and the cold winter air of Warsaw, Poland, provided a stark contrast to the tropical heat required by the venomous snakes housed in Elena Morozova's apartment. Inside the climate-controlled room that served as her reptile sanctuary, the temperature was maintained at a constant 80 degrees Fahrenheit, optimal conditions for the African species she specialized in keeping. Elena Morozova was a 29-year-old graphic designer living in Warsaw who had spent much of her free time immersed in the world of reptiles and amphibians. Her apartment, particularly a spare room she had converted into a climate-controlled reptile space, reflected years of dedication to the hobby. Thermostats regulated temperature and humidity, specialized lighting simulated tropical day cycles, and carefully labeled enclosures housed species most people only encountered behind glass in zoos. Elena was widely regarded within her local reptile community as knowledgeable and meticulous. She attended reptile expos, exchanged husbandry advice online, and spent countless hours researching the behavior and care requirements of venomous species. Over 6 years, she had built a collection that included several medically significant snakes, animals whose venom required specialized anti-venom treatments in case of bites. But with that experience came a gradual sense of familiarity. Like many experienced keepers, Elena had performed enclosure transfers hundreds of times without incident. Over time, the strict caution recommended for venomous snakes sometimes gave way to efficiency, a belief that experience could compensate for risks that less experienced handlers were warned never to take. On the evening of January 17th, Elena decided to move her green mamba from its primary enclosure to a temporary holding container while she cleaned its habitat. The standard protocol involves using a snake hook to guide the animal into a secure transfer box, maintaining distance at all times. Elena had performed this procedure dozens of times using proper equipment. This time, she decided to save time by free-handling the snake, using her hands to guide it directly into the transfer container. Her reasoning was straightforward. The transfer was only a few feet. The snake had been calm during previous handlings, and using the hook seemed unnecessarily slow. This reasoning failed to account for the fact that green mambas are among the fastest striking snakes in the world and possess venom that can kill a human in under an hour. Elena opened the enclosure and reached in with both hands, intending to lift the mamba into the transfer container nearby. The snake, resting on a branch, immediately became alert. Its head rose, tongue flicking rapidly as it assessed the situation. Green mambas are highly nervous snakes that rely on speed and venom for defense. They can strike with extraordinary quickness, covering distances of several feet in a fraction of a second. Their venom is a potent cocktail of neurotoxins attacking the nervous system, causing rapid onset of dizziness, difficulty breathing, muscle weakness, and paralysis. Unlike hemotoxic venoms that destroy tissue over hours, neurotoxic venoms act quickly, with severe envenomations leading to respiratory failure within 30 to 60 minutes without treatment. As Elena's hands approached, the mamba struck. The attack was so fast that Elena barely registered the movement before she felt the sharp pain in her right wrist. The snake's fangs had penetrated the skin and injected a large volume of venom directly into her tissue. The entire strike lasted less than a second. Elena jerked her hand back, staring at the 2 small puncture wounds already beginning to swell. The mamba retreated to the back of the enclosure, its defensive strike complete. Elena knew immediately that she was in serious trouble. Within minutes, the first symptoms appeared. Dizziness washed over her, making it difficult to stand. Her vision blurred. When she tried to call for help, her speech came out thick and distorted. Muscle weakness spread through her limbs with alarming speed, making it increasingly difficult to move. Elena managed to reach her phone and dial emergency services, but by the time she finished explaining what had happened, her breathing had become labored. The neurotoxins were attacking the muscles that controlled her diaphragm and chest wall, making each breath shallower than the last. Paramedics arrived within 20 minutes of her call, a response time that would have been adequate for many medical emergencies, but was insufficient for green mamba envenomation. By the time they reached Elena's apartment, she had lost consciousness, her respiratory system shutting down as the venom completed its work. She was rushed to the hospital, where medical staff attempted respiratory support and administered antivenin. But the venom had acted too quickly. Elena's brain had been deprived of oxygen for too long. Despite aggressive treatment, she was pronounced dead approximately 2 hours after the initial bite. The cause of death was neurotoxic envenomation, leading to respiratory failure. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.